You're watching Talking Points, a focus on the political scene in Lubbock and across the South Plains.
And welcome back. Here's a look at some of the political headlines of the past week. The investigation into the Bond and Burroughs-Sullivan meeting fiasco continues. The Texas Tribune reporting this week that members of the House were sent this letter by Texas Rangers asking them to hand over any information relevant to the case in the next few days. But the main evidence in the case may be available to all of us. Conservative activist Michael Quinn Sullivan now tweeting that he will finally release his secret recording of the meeting in question later this week. Amazingly timed to happen right before House Republicans prepare to head to a retreat where Speaker Bonnen may have to make a case for his future leadership role. They'll have plenty to talk about, I'm sure. Meanwhile, the Chief Justice of the 7th Court of Appeals filing for re-election. Bryan Quinn has a home here and is a Tech Law School grad. Was first elected in 1994, appointed by Chief Justice by then Governor Rick Perry in 2005. The court's in Amarillo and covers 46 West Texas counties. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West spoke at an event in Amarillo this week. He's, of course, running for the state Republican Party chairmanship. Spent 22 years in the Army, was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives in Florida for one term.
It's important to get out there and hear the thoughts and concerns of the members of the Republican Party of Texas and to let them know what leadership is all about and to arm them with the truth, with facts, with good, strong points that they can go out and spread our message with.
West will face incumbent Chairman James Dickey. Republican delegates will choose their next party chair for the state at the Texas GOP convention next May. Well, the impeachment inquiry continues into President Trump, and as that happens, the limits of Congress are being put on full display. Limits not just because of hyperpartisanship, but because of the law. The White House has vowed to fight the inquiry at every step. And one question now is, can Democrats in Congress actually force the president to comply? Beyond the spin, KMAC's Trevor Shirley teaches us what Congress can and cannot do.
It's just a scam. This is a scam by the Democrats to try and win an election that they're not going to win in 2020.
The White House has ignored subpoenas, blocked witness testimony, and refused to release documents by House Democrats.
So the assertion of the executive's authority to disobey the will of a co-equal branch of Congress has reached a level that we have never seen in this country's history.
George Washington University law professor Paul Schiff Berman says the showdown is a constitutional crisis.
Law is only as powerful as people's willingness to follow it.
So where does that leave Congress? Berman says with two options: move ahead with articles of impeachment or take it to the courts.
The problem with going into court is that it then delays the process.
Some experts say that leaves House Democrats without a strong hand to play.
Congress doesn't have any really powerful tools at its disposal to quickly force the executive branch to hand over information.
From the beginning, House Republicans have said the inquiry is just another attack on President Trump. But House Democrats say the American public deserves transparency.
He's doing his job, his duty as the commander-in-chief, his duty as the president of the United States.
The American people have the right to know if the president is acting in their interests.
Berman says who will end up knowing what and when depends largely on the White House. Reporting in Washington, I'm Trevor Shirley.
Trevor, Lubbock Congressman Jody Arrington has signed on to a resolution to censor Mr. Schiff there for misleading the American people about the phone call between Mr. Trump and the Ukrainian president. He also calls the impeachment inquiry baseless, saying in part, Democrats should make their case at the ballot box instead of engaging in this incredibly destructive process. But whether or not any of this is baseless, sometimes beyond the facts, depends largely on your own point of view and your own experience. And those opinions are what will shape the vote in 2020 and beyond, of course. Lots of people like to read and listen to the point of view of political commentator and columnist George Will. He was in Lubbock this week for a speech for Texas Tech's Free Market Institute. And all this was on his mind when he sat for 5 good minutes with KMAC's Avery Travis.
You've written a lot about the impeachment inquiry, in fact, calling it futile. Explain what that means for people, and do you think your opinion on that might change as we learn more?
Well, a lot of people, when they hear the word impeachment, they think removal from office. Impeachment is actually only setting up the trial in the Senate. The House sets up the trial in the Senate. It is even if all 47 senators who caucus with the Democrats were to vote to remove President Trump from office, they'd still require 20 Republicans. And it's highly unlikely, to put it mildly, that 20 Republicans would vote to do that.
This impeachment inquiry coming just a year ahead of the election next year. You've, of course, written about 2020 as it's about a year away. You have an interesting theory about what America needs to see in this next election as opposed to what we saw the last time around. Could you summarize that for people and then talk a little bit about that?
Well, the last time around, for the first time in American history, we had two presidential candidates, both of whom, as the campaign began after Labor Day, had higher negatives, disapprovals, than approvals. We'd never had one such candidate in American history. We had two of them in 2016. So we are going to have a president seeking re-election who lost the popular vote by 2.7 million votes. It's very hard to see how Mr. Trump can win the popular vote the next time around. Still, we now know, because he showed us the last time, that there's a path to 270 electoral votes. So we're going to, this time around, it's going to be different than 2016. 2016, people said, let's give him a try. So the Trump triers, as it were, have voted. They've seen, and we'll just see how many of them want to have another 4 years.
Obviously, a heated race on the Democratic side, quite a few people tossing their hat in the ring. Do you have any take on who we might start to see weed out and rise to the top?
Joe Biden got in the race partly because of name recognition, partly because his association with Barack Obama, who's very popular in the Democratic Party. He was the front runner to start with. Elizabeth Warren seems to have dominated the progressive wing, the left wing of the Democratic Party. At this point, and strange things can happen in the final days, but at this point, the Democratic nominee, you'd have to say, will either be Biden or Warren, with a big asterisk over that proposition. Someone can come out of nowhere in Iowa, do well, and be catapulted into New Hampshire, and catapulted from there into South Carolina, and catapulted from there into Nevada, and strange things can happen.
Pivoting again, recently the loss of Cokie Roberts, arguably one of the greatest journalists of all time. You worked closely with her. If you could talk a little bit about what it was like working with her and her legacy she leaves behind.
Well, Cokie was, in a way, an anachronism, a throwback to an earlier pre-tribal politics. Her father was a very distinguished congressman, a leader of the Democratic Party in the House. When he died in a plane crash in Alaska, her mother took his seat from Louisiana, and she served with great distinction then as ambassador to the Vatican. Cokie represented Washington before civility evaporated. Washington when it was perfectly normal to have friends across the aisle. Washington when we knew that the whole world did not depend on the next election or the next vote in the House or in the Senate. When the temperature was lower because the stakes of politics were not as ferocious.
That brought me perfectly to my last question for you. The state of politics right now, some saying more partisan than ever, ferocious, I think a very accurate word. Where do you think we go from here? Is there a way to find a way back to that old way of having friends across the aisle and being able to work together?
I think the left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party are composed of angry people. But most Americans are not angry. Most Americans are not listening to talk radio and they're not watching cable television. They're raising children, fixing the screen door, washing a car, and getting on with life. I think the great American middle, and it's huge, is composed of people who are not angry, but they're sad and embarrassed. And they're sad because they're embarrassed about the behavior of the leadership in Washington. And I think the American majority will be heard from. It's just up to one party or the other to give them someone who says, deep breath, everybody, the world's not coming to an end, the sky is not falling, and no one ever got rich betting against America. And people will calm down, and we're going to look back on this period and say, what got into us?